It is late autumn, roughly 15,000 years ago, in what we now call the Dordogne Valley of southwestern France. The air has turned sharp and metallic, carrying the scent of bruised pine and wet limestone. For 3 days, a massive atmospheric river, a ribbon of moisture flowing straight from the North Atlantic, has been dumping a relentless, bone-chilling rain across the mammoth steppe. The reindeer have hunkered down in the valley floor, their fur matted and heavy, while the wind howls through the leafless birch trees like a wounded animal. Inside a limestone overhang, a small group of humans is huddled together, watching the gray curtain of water blur the horizon. They aren't going anywhere. For the next week, their world is exactly 40 feet wide and 10 feet deep. This isn't just a bad commute or a ruined weekend. This is a week-long test of their sanity, their technology, and their ability to keep a tiny, flickering orange light alive in a world of absolute gray. Which, if you think about it, is a feeling you actually know pretty well. Have you ever had those Sunday mornings where the rain is just hammering against the glass, and you realize every single plan you made is officially canceled? You probably reached for your phone, ordered a pizza that some poor soul had to drive through the floods, and then spent 6 hours arguing with a streaming service about what to watch. You feel that specific kind of stuck energy, a mix of cozy comfort and a weird, restless itch under your skin. But for our ancestors, that restless itch was a survival mechanism. We are the descendants of the people who didn't just sit there and rot when the weather turned foul. While the rain was trying to freeze their blood and drown their fires, they were busy reinventing what it meant to be human. They were turning a crisis into a workshop. Actually, and this is the part we usually get wrong, rain wasn't just a minor annoyance for them. It was a biological emergency. You might think being wet is just uncomfortable, but for a prehistoric human, it was a ticking clock. Because of the way our skin is designed, a wet human loses body heat up to 25 times faster than a dry one. If the temperature outside is 50 degrees, which is a pretty standard chilly day, and you get soaked to the bone, your core temperature can start dropping into the danger zone in under an hour. You don't have Gore-Tex. You don't have a dryer. You have animal hides that, once wet, become heavy, slimy, and eventually start to rot. So, the very first thing they did when the clouds rolled in was a frantic, high-stakes game of logistics. Which brings us to a weird bit of biology you've definitely noticed on your own body: pruny fingers. You know how your fingertips get all wrinkled after a long bath? For decades, doctors thought this was just the skin absorbing water. But in 2011, an evolutionary biologist named Mark Changizi discovered something fascinating. Those wrinkles aren't accidental. They are a specialized rain tread for your hands. They act like the grooves on a car tire, channeling water away so you can maintain a grip on wet surfaces. Our ancestors evolved those wrinkles specifically so they could still climb trees or hold onto a slippery stone tool when the world turned into a mud pit. It's a permanent, built-in reminder that our bodies spent hundreds of thousands of years preparing for a rainy week. But even with high-traction fingers, you still can't hunt in a deluge. The sound of the rain masks the noise of your footsteps, sure, but it also masks the noise of the saber-toothed cat stalking you. More importantly, it kills your sense of smell and wipes away tracks. So, if you're stuck in that cave, your number one job, the thing that keeps everyone from dying of exposure, is the fire. And this was much harder than you're imagining. Before about 40,000 years ago, we aren't even sure if every group knew how to start a fire from scratch. For a huge chunk of our history, humans were firekeepers, not firemakers. If your flame went out during a week-long storm, you couldn't just strike a match. You were done. This is why ancient humans were obsessed with a very specific kind of mushroom called Fomes fomentarius, or tinder fungus. If you've ever seen a shelf-like mushroom growing on the side of a birch tree, that's it. It's basically a biological sponge for fire. You can take a smoldering coal, wrap it in the inner layers of this fungus, and it will stay hot for hours, even days, without turning to ash. When archaeologists found Otzi, the Iceman, a guy who died in the Alps about 5,000 years ago, he was carrying a pouch with this exact fungus inside. He was essentially carrying a save game for his fire. During a rainy week, one person's entire existence would be dedicated to fire-sitting, which sounds boring until you realize that if they fall asleep and the fire dies, the whole family might not wake up the next morning. And while one person was fire-sitting, everyone else was entering what researchers call a high-density manufacturing phase. When you can't go outside to get food, you spend every waking second preparing for the moment the sun comes back. This is where the archaeology gets really cool. In caves like Blombos in South Africa, we see layers of dirt that are just absolutely carpeted in debitage, the tiny, razor-sharp flakes of stone that fall off when you're making a spearhead. If you look at the floor of a cave, you can actually see where people sat based on the piles of these chips. They would sit in a circle around the fire, using the light to perform surgery on rocks.
Which, if we're being honest, is the original version of doom scrolling, just with more productivity. They would spend hours pressure flaking a single piece of flint, turning it from a dull rock into a surgical instrument. A study by experimental archaeologists found that it takes about 4 to 6 hours of intense, focused work to create a high-quality Clovis-style spear point. That is a perfect rainy afternoon project. But they weren't just making weapons. They were making the things that made life bearable. At Sibudu Cave, which is a massive rock shelter in South Africa, a researcher named Dr. Lynn Wadley found something mind-blowing from 77,000 years ago. It was bedding. But it wasn't just a pile of grass. These people had specifically chosen a plant called Cryptocarya woodii, or Cape Laurel. Why that plant? Because when you crush the leaves or sit on them, they release a natural chemical that acts as an insecticide. They were literally manufacturing pest repellent mattresses while waiting for the rain to stop. Think about the level of observation required for that. You have to notice which plants the bugs avoid, gather them, and layer them in your sleeping area. During a rainy week, when everyone is crammed together and body heat is attracting every flea and tick in the valley, that insect repellent bed was the difference between a restful night and a week of skin-crawling misery. And then there's the string. You probably don't think about string very often, but it is arguably the most important invention in human history. Without string, you don't have bows, you don't have nets, you don't have warm clothing, and you don't have baskets. But making string is incredibly tedious. You have to find the right plants, soak the fibers, strip them, and then twist them together for hours and hours. It is the ultimate I have nothing else to do task. At a site in France called Aubry du Marais, archaeologists found a tiny piece of 3-ply cord made from inner bark fibers that dates back 52,000 years. It was made by a Neanderthal. This tells us that even our cousins were sitting in the dark, twisting fibers together while the rain hammered down outside, building the literal foundations of the garment industry. Actually, and this might sound a bit like a stretch, but rain might be the reason we have such complex language. When you're hunting, you have to be quiet. You use hand signals. You're focused on the horizon. But when you're stuck in a cave for a week with 20 other people, you have to talk. You have no choice. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent decades studying the Jew/Hoansi people of the Kalahari and found that there is a massive difference between daytime talk and firelight talk. During the day, people talk about work, who's hunting what, where the water is, who's annoyed with whom. It's all practical and often stressful. But at night, or during those long stretches of being stuck inside, the conversation changes. It becomes about stories. It becomes about what-ifs. Wiesner found that over 80% of fireside talk was dedicated to storytelling and myth-making. This is when the elders would explain how the stars got into the sky, or why the rain falls in the first place. These weren't just bedtime stories, they were the cultural glue that held the tribe together. They were encoded survival manuals. A story about a legendary hunter who survived a flood wasn't just entertainment. It was a lesson on which high ground spots to hit when the river rises. Those rainy weeks were the upload time for the group's collective brain. Which leads us to the most haunting part of the rainy day experience, the art. If you've ever seen photos of the Chauvet Cave or Lascaux, you know they are filled with breathtaking paintings of horses, lions, and rhinos. But here's the thing. Many of these paintings are located hundreds of feet deep into the cave, in places where there is zero natural light. You have to crawl through tight, muddy squeezes to get there. Why would anyone do that? Well, imagine you've been stuck in the entrance of a cave for 5 days. You've sharpened all your tools. You've twisted a mile of string. You've told every story you know. The rainy day boredom starts to set in. So you take a small stone lamp filled with rendered animal fat. You grab a handful of charcoal and red ochre, and you go deep. You go into the one place where the rain can't be heard. In that absolute silence, by the flickering light of a fat lamp, the walls of the cave start to look like animals. The bumps in the rock look like the shoulders of a bison. The cracks look like the legs of a deer. You start to paint. Some researchers believe that the cognitive revolution, that moment when humans started thinking in symbols and art, was fueled by these long periods of forced isolation and sensory deprivation. The rain pushed us inward, both into the caves and into our own minds.
And if you think that's just a nice theory, look at the Green Sahara period. Between 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert wasn't a wasteland. It was a lush, rainy paradise filled with lakes and hippos. Archaeologists have found thousands of rock art sites in the middle of the desert from this era. When the rains came and stayed for generations, the human population exploded, and so did our creativity. We weren't just surviving the rain, we were using the downtime it provided to invent religion, music, and complex social hierarchies. We were leveling up our culture while we waited for the clouds to part. Which, if we're being honest, makes our modern version of a rainy day look a little pathetic. We have all this downtime, but we usually spend it consuming other people's stories instead of making our own. We have save games on our consoles, but we've forgotten how to keep a literal fire alive. Our ancestors didn't have boredom in the way we do, because their boredom was productive. It was a pressure cooker for innovation. If you didn't invent a better way to waterproof your shelter or a better way to store food during that rainy week, you didn't make it to the next season. The stakes were high, and the results were legendary. But let's get specific about the food situation, because you can't just skip meals for a week. What did they eat when the mammoths were too far away to track? This is where microarchaeology comes in. By analyzing coprolites, which is a polite scientific word for fossilized poop, researchers can see exactly what was on the menu during lean times. And it turns out, rainy weeks were the era of the small harvest. They ate things that didn't require a spear. They ate snails. They ate grubs. They ate the tubers and roots they had spent the sunny days gathering and drying. Actually, and this is a bit gross but fascinating, some groups would gorge on termites. In many parts of the world, termites swarm right after a heavy rain. They are incredibly high in protein and fat, essentially the power bars of the Paleolithic. You don't have to hunt them, you just stand there and pick them out of the air. So, while the big game hunters were stuck in the cave grumbling about the weather, the children and the elderly were often the ones providing the most calories by gathering the rain gifts that the storm brought to the surface. It was a complete shift in the social economy of the tribe. And then, finally, the rain stops. The gray curtain lifts, and for the first time in a week, the sun hits the valley floor. But the world is different now. The ground is soft and malleable. And this is the golden hour for an ancient hunter. Because on soft, wet ground, every single animal leaves a perfect, high-resolution signature of its passing. You can see the depth of the hoofprint to know how heavy the deer is. You can see the drag of a paw to know if the wolf is injured. The rain didn't just hide the world, it reset the canvas. The hunters would walk out of that cave, their newly sharpened tools in hand, their bellies full of termites and dried roots, and they would see the entire map of the valley laid out in the mud. They would follow those tracks with a renewed energy, because they weren't just hunters anymore, they were a team that had survived another trial. They had shared stories, they had mended their gear, and they had reinforced the bonds that kept them alive. They had taken a week of chaos and turned it into a week of preparation. Every time you feel that weird, productive urge to clean your house or start a new project when it's raining outside, that is a 200,000-year-old echo in your brain. That is the cave workshop instinct kicking in. It's the voice of an ancestor telling you not to just sit there, but to make something, fix something, or tell a story that's worth remembering. Because the truth is, we aren't just the smart apes. We are the rainy day apes. We are the species that learned how to thrive in the gaps between the action. We learned how to turn the dead time of a storm into the live time of innovation. While every other animal on the planet was just huddling and waiting for the sun, We were busy inventing the needle, the story, and the god of thunder. We used the darkness to find our inner light, and we used the silence to find our voice. Which brings us back to that limestone overhang in France 15,000 years ago. As the group emerges into the sunlight, they leave behind a cave floor that is littered with the evidence of their victory. They leave behind the tiny stone chips, the discarded fibers of their string making, and the faint smell of Cape Laurel from their beds. But they also leave something else. Deep in the back of the cave, where the walls are still damp and the air is still cool, there is a painting of a bison. It is vibrant, red, and alive. It wasn't there a week ago. It is the proof that even when the world outside was falling apart, someone in that cave was busy dreaming. And if you think that was just a one-time occurrence, consider this. The sheer volume of material produced during these stuck periods is so vast that it makes up the bulk of the archaeological record. We don't find much evidence of what people did on sunny days, because on sunny days, they were spread out, moving fast, and leaving very little behind. But the rainy day layers in caves are thick, rich, and dense with information. The rain, in a very literal sense, is what preserved our history. It forced us to stay in one place long enough to leave a mark that would last for 10,000 years. So, the next time you're looking out your window at a gray, drizzly Tuesday, and you feel that familiar sense of wasted time, just remember what your ancestors did with their wasted weeks. They didn't just wait for the world to get better, they made themselves better while they waited. They turned the rain into a tool, and they turned the cave into a cathedral of human potential. You come from a long line of people who were at their best when the weather was at its worst. And that's not just a nice sentiment, it's a biological fact written into the very shape of your fingertips. But perhaps the most striking thing about these ancient rainy days isn't the tools or the art, but the sheer endurance of the memories they created. We often think of prehistory as a vast, blurry void, but for the people living through it, it was a series of very specific, very intense moments. They remembered that one storm that lasted 10 days. They remembered the year the river swallowed the valley. And they passed those memories down with such terrifying precision that we can still hear the echoes of them today. We are a species built on the stories we told each other while we were waiting for the mud to dry. And if you still think a week of rain is just a minor blip in the grand story of humanity, you're missing the scale of the challenge. You're assuming that survival was a given. It wasn't. For every group that sat in a cave and painted bison, there was another group that let their fire go out. There was another group that didn't know about the insect-repellent leaves and died of a fever. There was another group that didn't have the rain-tread fingers to climb to safety when the flash flood hit. You are the product of the winners, the ones who treated the rain like a deadline rather than a disaster. Which leads us to one final, undeniable truth that dismantles everything you think you know about how slow ancient life was. We tend to think of progress as this steady, uphill climb. But in reality, it happened in fits and starts, often triggered by the environment. And nothing triggered a start like being trapped. In the history of our species, the most rapid periods of technological advancement didn't happen during the long, easy summers of plenty. They happened during the harsh, unpredictable Heinrich events, massive pulses of icebergs into the North Atlantic that caused abrupt, violent shifts in global rainfall patterns. During these periods, the rain didn't just last for a week, it could last for decades, or disappear for centuries. And every single time the weather turned, humans did exactly what they did in that French cave. They adapted, they innovated, and they told better stories. They took the cozy feeling of the fire and turned it into the social feeling of a tribe. They took the restless feeling of being stuck and turned it into the creative feeling of an artist. They were never just waiting. They were becoming. So, the next time the clouds roll in and the forecast says, rain all week, don't just reach for the remote. Reach for a project. Reach for a story. Reach for that person sitting across from you and talk about something that actually matters. Because you have 200,000 years of rainy day DNA screaming at you to do something with this time. You are the descendant of the people who conquered the storm by staying still. And that is a legacy worth living up to, even if you're just doing it from the comfort of your couch. After all, your ancestors didn't just survive the rain, they used it to build the world you're currently standing in. They didn't have Netflix, but they had the entire universe inside their heads, and a week of rain was the only time they had to explore it. So, what are you going to do with your next storm? Are you going to just be stuck, or are you going to be human? The choice is yours, but remember, the bar has been set pretty high by a group of people who didn't even have shoes, but still managed to paint the stars. Which brings us to the final haunting number that puts your entire existence into perspective. We think of ourselves as the masters of the planet, the people who have finally conquered the elements. But the reality is that we are still entirely at the mercy of the water. And if you think a week of rain is a long time, consider the Carnian pluvial event that occurred 230 million years ago. It didn't rain for a week. It didn't rain for a month. On an Earth that was previously a desert, it started raining, and according to the geological record, it did not stop for exactly 2 million years. That is the kind of rainy day that changes the world forever. And compared to that, your rainy week is just a blink of an eye. What are you going to do with your blink? I'd love to hear about your own rainy day projects, or if you've ever felt that weird surge of creativity when the weather turns. Let me know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into how our ancestors survived the impossible, hit that subscribe button and stick around. The next storm is always coming.